I sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hearing room, staring in disbelief as my own father and sister testified against me under oath. They were actively trying to send me to prison for the unauthorized practice of law. What they didn't know was that the disciplinary judge holding my fate was already in on my secret. If you looked at the glossy brochure for Montgomery and Associates, a boutique civil litigation firm in downtown Chicago, you would see two smiling faces. Arthur Montgomery, my father, a silver-haired titan of the local bar association, and his newly minted junior partner, my older sister, Rebecca. What you wouldn't see was me, Chloe Montgomery. I was officially listed in the firm's directory as a senior legal assistant, but within the four walls of that mahogany-paneled office, I was the ghost in the machine. I was the shadow partner. The family dynamic was established long before we ever set foot in a courtroom. Rebecca was the golden child, charismatic, beautiful, and fiercely ambitious, but completely allergic to hard work. I was the quiet, bookish younger sister who actually enjoyed untangling complex legal precedents. When we both went to law school, Arthur paid for Rebecca's expensive private tutoring, while I worked double shifts at a diner to cover my rent. Rebecca failed the bar exam twice. On her third attempt, she barely scraped by. I, on the other hand, missed the passing score by a mere 3 points on my first try, entirely because I had spent the prior 2 weeks writing Rebecca's appellate brief for her first major solo case at our father's firm. Exhausted and thoroughly burned out, I never retook the exam. Arthur convinced me that the firm needed a brilliant mind in the back office and promised me that if I acted as Rebecca's right hand, I'd be compensated fairly. It was the biggest lie of my life. For 5 years, I was the brain of Montgomery and Associates, while Rebecca was the face. She took the 3-hour lunches with clients at upscale steakhouses. I stayed at my desk until 2 a.m., eating cold takeout and drafting the motions that actually won the cases. When Rebecca stood up in court and eloquently delivered an opening statement, she was reading off index cards I had meticulously color-coded the night before. The resentment was a slow, toxic drip, but it didn't boil over until the Sterling estate case landed on our desks. Martha Sterling was a 72-year-old widow whose late husband, a wealthy real estate developer, had unexpectedly left his entire $50 million estate to his estranged children from a previous marriage, leaving Martha with essentially nothing. The amendment to the trust had been signed just days before his death, while he was heavily medicated. It was a classic case of undue influence, but proving it required sifting through thousands of pages of medical records, financial statements, and obscure trust laws. Martha was a sweet, fragile woman who reminded me of my late grandmother. She came to our office weeping, terrified she was going to lose the home she had lived in for 30 years. Arthur immediately assigned the case to Rebecca, smelling a massive contingency fee. "This is a career maker, Becca," Arthur told her in his corner office, swirling a glass of scotch. "Slam dunk. Just put the pressure on the stepkids and they'll settle." "Consider it done, Dad," Rebecca beamed, before turning to me. "Chloe, I need a comprehensive memo on the medical timeline by Friday. Oh, and draft the initial discovery requests. Make them aggressive. For the next 3 months, I lived and breathed the Sterling case. I found glaring inconsistencies in the late husband's medical charts. I discovered hidden offshore accounts the stepchildren had set up to funnel the trust money. I built an airtight, bulletproof case that proved Martha's husband lacked the testamentary capacity to change his will. But Rebecca, as usual, wasn't paying attention. She was too busy planning a destination wedding with her fiancé, completely neglecting the client. She would ignore Martha's frantic phone calls, leaving me to soothe the terrified widow. Whenever I tried to brief Rebecca on the explosive evidence I had uncovered, she would wave me off. "Just put it in a binder, Chloe," she'd say, filing her nails. "I'll review it before the mediation." The breaking point came 2 weeks before the statute of limitations to file a specific fraud claim was set to expire. I had placed the drafted complaint on Rebecca's desk, flagged with bright red sticky notes, begging her to review and sign it. Without that filing, our leverage in the case would evaporate, and Martha would be left with pennies. I checked the court docket every day. Nothing was filed. When I finally cornered Rebecca in the break room, she looked at me with total blankness. "The fraud claim?" she asked, sipping a latte. "Oh, I decided not to file it. It felt too aggressive for this stage." I'm just going to negotiate with their lawyer over golf on Sunday. I stared at her, my blood running cold. Rebecca, you can't negotiate without leverage. If you let that deadline pass, you are committing legal malpractice. They will steamroll you. She rolled her eyes, her tone dripping with condescension. Remind me, Chloe, which one of us has the law degree? Right. Me. I'm the attorney. You're the paralegal. Stay in your lane and let me handle the strategy. She walked out, leaving me standing in the sterile kitchenette, realizing with horrifying clarity that my sister was about to destroy an innocent woman's life out of sheer arrogance and incompetence. I couldn't let it happen. I decided, right then and there, to cross a line I had never crossed before. I waited until Friday evening, long after Arthur had left for his country club and Rebecca had departed for a weekend getaway in Aspen. The office was dead silent, save for the hum of the HVAC system. I sat at my desk, staring at the drafted fraud complaint. It was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering, cross-referencing state statutes and the medical anomalies I had discovered. It was exactly what Martha Sterling needed to force a fair settlement, but it was completely useless without an attorney's signature. I knew the password to Rebecca's electronic filing account. I was the one who managed it, after all. Technically, affixing an attorney's electronic signature without their direct, specific consent on a document they hadn't reviewed was a severe ethical violation. But Rebecca had told me to handle the paperwork before she left. It was a flimsy excuse, but my conscience wouldn't let Martha lose her home. Taking a deep breath, I logged into the court's e-filing portal. I attached the PDF, typed S. Rebecca Montgomery on the signature line, and hit submit. The confirmation receipt popped into the inbox. It was done, but I didn't stop there. Knowing Rebecca was utterly unprepared for the upcoming mediation, I called Martha Sterling directly from my cell phone on Saturday morning. We met at a quiet coffee shop near her house. Chloe, dear, what's going on? Martha asked, clutching her tea with trembling hands. Rebecca hasn't returned my calls in weeks. For the next 2 hours, I sat with Martha and did something only a licensed attorney is legally allowed to do. I gave her direct legal counsel. I explained the strengths and weaknesses of her case, the strategy behind the fraud claim I had just filed, and exactly what numbers she should accept and reject during mediation. I walked her through the tax implications of the trust and advised her on how to establish a new estate plan once we won. You are a godsend, Chloe, Martha wept, squeezing my hands. I feel so much better. You are the best lawyer in that whole firm. I'm not a lawyer, Martha, I reminded her gently. I'm just the legal assistant. Well, you act more like one than your sister, she replied with a sad smile. I went home that weekend feeling terrified but justified. I had saved the case, but on Monday morning, the atmosphere in the office was suffocatingly tense. As soon as I stepped off the elevator, the receptionist gave me a wide-eyed, panicked look. Arthur wants you in his office. Now, she whispered. When I walked in, Arthur was standing behind his desk, his face a mask of purple fury. Rebecca was sitting on the leather sofa, her arms crossed, looking both furious and strangely smug. Printed out on the desk was the e-filing receipt for the fraud complaint, alongside a detailed email from Martha Sterling, thanking Rebecca for allowing Chloe to explain the entire legal strategy so brilliantly over coffee. Close the door, Arthur growled. I clicked the door shut. Dad, I can explain. You forged your sister's signature on a court document, Arthur roared, slamming his fist on the desk. And then you met with a high-net-worth client behind her back and dispensed legal advice. Do you have any idea what you've done? I saved the case, I shot back, the years of repressed anger finally bubbling up. Rebecca was going to let the statute of limitations expire. She was going to commit malpractice, Dad. I had to file it, and someone had to tell Martha what was going on because her actual attorney is too busy picking out floral arrangements to care. Rebecca leaped up. You psycho! You undermined me. Opposing counsel called me this morning screaming about a fraud claim I didn't even know existed. You made me look like a fool. You are a fool, Rebecca, I yelled. You don't know the first thing about the law. I have carried you for 5 years. I do everything. You're a glorified secretary, Arthur bellowed, stepping toward me. You failed the bar, Chloe. You are not a lawyer. What you did wasn't just insubordinate, it was illegal. It's the unauthorized practice of law. UPL is a felony in this state. I was protecting the firm, I pleaded, my voice cracking. If I hadn't acted, Martha would have sued us for everything we have. Arthur's eyes were cold, calculating. He wasn't looking at his daughter. He was looking at a liability. He and Rebecca exchanged a brief, dark look that made my stomach plummet. I realized in that split second that they weren't just angry about my insubordination. They were terrified. If it came to light that Rebecca was completely incompetent and that an unlicensed paralegal was running their biggest cases, the firm's reputation would be destroyed. They needed a scapegoat. You are terminated. Effective immediately, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. Pack your desk. Security will escort you out. Dad, I whispered. I am not your father right now. I am the managing partner of this firm. Get out. I packed my meager belongings into a cardboard box while Rebecca stood in the doorway, watching me with a satisfied smirk. As I walked out of the building, the crisp Chicago air hit my face, and the reality of my situation crushed me. I was unemployed, broke, and disgraced. But the real nightmare hadn't even begun. 3 weeks later, there was a sharp knock on my apartment door. 2 men in suits were standing in the hallway. One flashed a badge. Chloe Montgomery? He asked. Yes. I'm Investigator Davis with the State Bar Association, and this is Detective Miller with the District Attorney's Office. We're serving you with formal notice. He handed me a thick manila envelope. You are being investigated for the unauthorized practice of law, forgery, and wire fraud. The complaint was filed by your former employer, Montgomery and Associates. My heart stopped. My own father and sister hadn't just fired me. They had gone to the authorities. They had spun a story claiming I was a rogue employee who had hacked into their systems, stolen client data, and impersonated an attorney to extort clients. They were pinning all of Rebecca's past mistakes and missed deadlines on my unauthorized interference. If convicted on all counts, the detective added flatly, you're looking at a minimum of 3 to 5 years in state prison. I suggest you find a very good lawyer. I closed the door, my legs giving out as I slid down to the floor, clutching the envelope. My family had set a trap, and I had walked right into it to save a client they didn't care about. They were going to sacrifice my freedom to protect their own licenses. I was entirely alone, facing the wrath of the legal establishment with no license, no money, and no allies. Or so I thought. I didn't know yet that the judge assigned to head the disciplinary committee reviewing my criminal referral was the Honorable Harrison Caldwell. And Judge Caldwell knew exactly who I was. The prospect of a state prison sentence has a way of clarifying your reality. For 3 days after the investigators knocked on my door, I didn't sleep. I survived on stale coffee and sheer, unadulterated panic. I paced the worn hardwood floors of my studio apartment, mapping out the state's criminal statutes on the unauthorized practice of law, forgery, and wire fraud. The irony was suffocating. I was researching my own defense using the exact same skills my father and sister were trying to imprison me for possessing. I needed a lawyer. But not just any lawyer. I needed someone who despised Arthur Montgomery as much as I was beginning to. That led me to the chaotic, paper-strewn office of Dominic Hayes. Dominic was a former public defender turned private criminal defense attorney who had built a reputation for taking on impossible cases and infuriating the city's legal elite. He was notorious for his disheveled suits, his razor-sharp memory, and his absolute refusal to settle if he smelled corruption. 2 years ago, Dominic had almost managed to get Arthur sanctioned for hiding discovery documents in a corporate liability suit, but Arthur's deep pockets and country club connections had buried the motion. When I walked into Dominic's office, he was buried behind a mountain of case files, a half-eaten bagel balancing precariously on a stack of depositions. I don't have time for civil disputes, Miss Montgomery, Dominic said without looking up, clearly recognizing my last name. If you're here to deliver a cease and desist from your father, put it on the spike file by the door. I'm not here for my father, I said, my voice trembling slightly before I forced it steady. I'm here because my father is trying to send me to prison. I need representation. That made him look up. Dominic's eyes narrowed, his gaze sweeping over my pale face and the thick manila envelope I clutched to my chest. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. Talk. For the next 2 hours, I laid it all bare. I told him about the 5 years of indentured servitude, the fabricated billing hours, the ghost-written motions, and the final, desperate act of forging Rebecca's signature to save Martha Sterling from losing her estate. I handed him my personal copies of the drafted complaints, the timestamps, and the frantic emails from Martha that Rebecca had ignored. Dominic flipped through the documents, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "They're charging you with wire fraud because of the e-filing," Dominic explained, leaning back in his creaking chair. "And they're pushing the UPL unauthorized practice of law as a felony because of the monetary value of the Sterling estate. Your father is a heavy hitter, Chloe. He's got the DA's ear. They want to make an example out of you to cover up their own malpractice. Can we win?" I asked, my chest tight. "It's a disciplinary and criminal referral board hearing first," Dominic said, tapping his pen against his desk. "If the board finds probable cause of egregious misconduct, they officially refer it to the DA for a grand jury indictment. The board is led by 3 judges. The chief disciplinary judge assigned to your docket is Harrison Caldwell." The name hit me like a physical blow. Judge Harrison Caldwell. "Caldwell," I breathed, my mind racing back 3 years. "You know him?" Dominic asked, raising an eyebrow. "I don't just know him," I whispered, the memory rushing back with crystal clarity. "He knows my secret." 3 years prior, Montgomery and Associates had taken on a massively convoluted appellate case involving international maritime law and corporate tax evasion, the Kensington Appeal. Arthur, in his infinite arrogance, had assigned Rebecca to argue it before a 3-judge panel headed by Caldwell. I had spent 6 sleepless weeks drafting a 70-page appellate brief that was so dense and legally complex I practically had an aneurysm writing it. During oral arguments, Judge Caldwell had bypassed the standard pleasantries and launched a highly specific, grueling line of questioning regarding a footnote I had written on page 42 about a loophole in the Jones Act. Rebecca had frozen. She stood at the podium, completely mute, her face draining of color. She fumbled through her index cards, entirely unable to comprehend the words she was supposed to be reading. Judge Caldwell, known for his utter lack of patience for unprepared attorneys, had called an abrupt 15-minute recess and ordered Rebecca into his chambers. Arthur wasn't there. He was golfing. Rebecca, terrified and near tears, had practically dragged me into chambers with her. "Counselor," Caldwell had barked at Rebecca, sitting behind his massive oak desk. "Explain the tax deferment argument in footnote 14, or I am dismissing your appeal with prejudice right now." Rebecca was hyperventilating. In a moment of pure panic, she looked at me and sobbed, "Chloe, just tell him." And I did. For 20 minutes in the private chambers of Judge Harrison Caldwell, I, a 26-year-old paralegal, delivered a flawless, unscripted oral argument breaking down the maritime tax loophole, citing 3 different Supreme Court precedents from memory. When I finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Judge Caldwell had looked at the weeping, trembling Rebecca, and then he looked at me. His piercing blue eyes missed nothing. He didn't ask if I was a lawyer. He didn't ask why I was speaking instead of the licensed attorney. He just nodded slowly, a look of profound disgust crossing his face as he stared at my sister. "I see exactly how this firm operates," Caldwell had muttered softly, more to himself than to us. He granted our appeal the next day, but in his written opinion, he specifically praised the unusual brilliance of the written brief while pointedly condemning the abysmal, borderline incompetent presentation at oral argument. "He knows," I told Dominic, feeling a sudden, wild spark of hope. "Caldwell knows Rebecca is a fraud. He saw it happen." Dominic's lips curved into a predatory smile. "A sympathetic judge is good, Chloe, but it's not enough. Your father is going to argue that you went rogue, that you're a disgruntled, jealous sister who stole passwords and hacked their system to play lawyer. We need physical proof that they ordered you to do it. We need a smoking gun that proves Arthur and Rebecca were complicit in every single keystroke you made. They wiped my computer the day they fired me," I said, the hope dimming. "Arthur bragged about having IT scrub the server of my access logs." "They scrubbed the firm's servers," Dominic corrected. "But you said you were working at 2 a.m. most nights. Where were you working from?" "My apartment," I said, "through the firm's VPN. And did you ever print anything here? At home?" I blinked, realizing where he was going. "My home printer. It has a localized hard drive cache. It stores the metadata of every document I ever printed. including the hidden dictation software logs I used to transcribe Arthur's verbal orders. Bingo, Dominic said, slamming his hand on the desk. Let's go hunting. For the next week, we practically lived in my apartment. Dominic brought in a forensic data recovery expert who extracted thousands of cached files from my cheap plastic home printer. What we found was a goldmine of systemic fraud. There were audio transcriptions of Arthur ordering me to draft complex litigation while explicitly telling me to bill it under Rebecca's associate code at $450 an hour. There were emails where Rebecca forwarded me opposing counsel's questions with a one-line demand. I have no idea what this means. Write a response for me to copy-paste. By the time the hearing date arrived, we hadn't just built a defense. We had built a guillotine. The State Bar Disciplinary hearing room was a sterile, intimidating amphitheater of mahogany and fluorescent lighting. It was designed to make you feel small. And as I took my seat at the respondent's table next to Dominic, it was working. My hands were shaking so badly I had to hide them under the table. Across the aisle, at the complainant's table, sat my family. Arthur wore his bespoke Navy Tom Ford suit, projecting an aura of aggrieved dignity. Rebecca sat next to him, wearing conservative pearls and a masterfully crafted expression of sorrowful betrayal. They didn't even look at me. To them, I wasn't a daughter or a sister anymore. I was an infection they were surgically removing to protect their empire. At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy oak doors behind the bench swung open, and the three-judge panel entered. In the center, gripping the gavel, was Judge Harrison Caldwell. He looked older than I remembered, his face lined with the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much human garbage in his career. As Caldwell took his seat, his eyes swept the room. They lingered on Arthur, then on Rebecca, and finally, they locked onto me. For a fraction of a second, the stern lines of his face softened, and he gave the most imperceptible nod. The trap was set. We are here today regarding the matter of the State Bar Association and the District Attorney's Office versus Chloe Montgomery, Judge Caldwell announced, his voice echoing off the wood panels. The respondent is facing allegations of the unauthorized practice of law, forgery of an officer of the court's signature, and wire fraud. The complainants, Arthur and Rebecca Montgomery, will present their evidence first. Arthur was called to the stand. He practically glided to the witness box, placing his hand on the Bible with practiced ease. The state bar prosecutor, a sharp-featured man named Preston, began the questioning. Mr. Montgomery, Preston asked sympathetically, can you describe your daughter Chloe's role at your firm? Chloe was a senior legal assistant. Arthur lied smoothly, his voice thick with fake emotion. She was responsible for filing, basic correspondence, and organizing exhibits. We tried to give her responsibilities, but, well, after she failed the bar exam, she became incredibly bitter. She developed an unhealthy jealousy toward her sister, Rebecca, who is a brilliant and licensed attorney. I dug my fingernails into my palms to keep from screaming. And when did you discover she was illegally practicing law? Preston prompted. A few weeks ago, Arthur sighed, looking down at his hands. We caught her hacking into Rebecca's secure e-filing account. She forged Rebecca's signature on a highly sensitive fraud complaint for the Sterling estate, and then met with the client in secret, passing herself off as the lead attorney. She could have destroyed the client's life. We had no choice but to terminate her and contact the authorities. It breaks my heart, but the integrity of the law must come first. Thank you, Mr. Montgomery, Preston said. Your witness, Mr. Hayes. Dominic stood up slowly, buttoning his disheveled jacket. He strolled toward the podium, an easy, dangerous smile playing on his lips. Mr. Montgomery, Dominic began, leaning against the wood. You testified that Chloe was a bitter, low-level assistant who only handled filing. Is that correct? Yes, Arthur said stiffly. Fascinating, Dominic said, pulling a document from his folder. Because I have here the firm's internal billing records for the past 5 years. Can you explain why low-level assistant Chloe Montgomery logged an average of 85 hours a week, while your brilliant partner Rebecca logged barely 20? Objection. Relevance, Preston called out. Goes to credibility, Your Honor, Dominic countered without looking away from Arthur. Overruled. You may answer the question, Mr. Montgomery, Judge Caldwell said, leaning forward. Arthur's jaw tightened. Administrative work can be very time-consuming. I see. Let's talk about the Sterling estate, Dominic pivoted sharply. You claim Chloe acted entirely alone, maliciously hijacking the case to sabotage your firm. Yet, I have a sworn affidavit from Martha Sterling, the client, stating that Rebecca Montgomery failed to return 19 consecutive phone calls over a 3-month period, while Chloe was the only person at the firm managing the discovery process. Rebecca was managing a heavy caseload, Arthur snapped, his polished veneer cracking slightly. Chloe overstepped her boundaries. No further questions for this witness, Dominic said dismissively. But we eagerly await the testimony of the lead attorney on the Sterling case. Arthur stepped down, glaring daggers at Dominic. Rebecca was called next. She looked incredibly nervous, her eyes darting between Arthur and the prosecutor. She repeated the same rehearsed lies. Chloe was unhinged. Chloe stole her password. Chloe was trying to ruin her career out of spite. When Dominic approached the podium for cross-examination, he didn't bring any notes. He just stared at Rebecca until she shifted uncomfortably in the wooden chair. "Miss Montgomery," Dominic said softly, "you are the attorney of record for the Sterling fraud complaint, the one Chloe supposedly forged your signature on." "Yes. She illegally filed it," Rebecca stated, her chin jutting out. "Can you tell the panel what the primary legal basis for the fraud claim in that document was?" Dominic asked. "Just a brief summary of the precedent cited." Rebecca froze. The color drained from her face, exactly as it had in Judge Caldwell's chambers 3 years ago. "I don't see how that is relevant. The issue is the forgery." "The issue, Miss Montgomery, is your competence," Dominic thundered, his voice suddenly filling the room. "Can you name a single case cited in the 30-page document that was filed under your name? Can you explain the rule of perpetuities as it applied to the Sterling Trust? Can you even define testamentary capacity?" "Objection." "Badgering the witness," Preston shouted. "Sustained. Dial it back, Mr. Hayes," Caldwell said, though his eyes were locked on Rebecca, practically burning holes through her. "My apologies, Your Honor," Dominic said smoothly. He walked back to our table and picked up a small digital tablet. "Let's move away from legal theory and look at hard evidence. Miss Montgomery, you testified under oath today that you had no knowledge of Chloe drafting the Sterling complaint, and that she stole your password to file it. Is that your sworn testimony?" "Yes," Rebecca squeaked, her hands trembling. "Your Honor, permission to play Defense Exhibit D into the record," Dominic requested. "Proceed," Judge Caldwell nodded. Dominic connected the tablet to the room's audio system. "This is a recovered audio file from the dictation software running on Chloe Montgomery's remote terminal, dated 3 days before the Sterling filing deadline." He pressed play. The pristine, undeniable sound of Rebecca's voice echoed through the speakers. "Chloe, I am not dealing with this Sterling garbage this weekend. I have a fitting for my wedding dress. Just write up whatever fraud claim you were talking about and use my login to file it. The password is still Aspen2023. Just get it done so Dad stops yelling at me." Then, Arthur's voice boomed in the background of the recording. "And make sure you bill 40 hours of drafting time under Rebecca's associate code, Chloe. The old lady can afford it." The silence in the hearing room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a devastating explosion. At the complainant's table, Arthur looked like he was having a stroke. His face was ashen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. In the witness box, Rebecca burst into hysterical, hyperventilating tears, burying her face in her hands. I looked up at the bench. Judge Harrison Caldwell wasn't looking at Arthur or Rebecca. He was looking at the state bar prosecutor, who was hastily packing his briefcase as if the table itself had caught fire. "Mr. Preston," Judge Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying rumble that promised absolute destruction. "It appears your key witnesses have just committed blatant, irrefutable perjury in my courtroom. Furthermore, they have openly confessed on tape to systematic billing fraud against a client. Your Honor, the state was completely unaware of this recording," Preston stammered, sweating profusely. "I believe you," Caldwell said coldly. He turned his gaze to Arthur, his eyes filled with righteous fury. "Mr. Montgomery, in my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely witnessed such a cowardly, despicable abuse of the legal profession. You did not just exploit your unlicensed daughter to run your law firm. You attempted to weaponize the criminal justice system, to lock her in a cage to hide your own abhorrent malpractice." Caldwell struck his gavel with a deafening crack. "The disciplinary charges against Chloe Montgomery are dismissed with prejudice," Caldwell announced. "Furthermore, I am officially referring Arthur and Rebecca Montgomery to the District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal investigation regarding perjury, extortion, and felony billing fraud. Bailiffs, do not let them leave this building until the DA's investigators arrive. The sound of Judge Caldwell's gavel echoing through the disciplinary hearing room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a 5-year nightmare finally fracturing. Before the echo even faded, two armed courthouse bailiffs flanked Arthur and Rebecca. Rebecca completely broke down, her polished arrogance dissolving into a hyperventilating mess as a bailiff pulled her arms backward. Arthur snarled, his face flushed a dangerous red, demanding to be released because he played golf with the mayor. The bailiff was unimpressed. As they were escorted down the center aisle in handcuffs, Arthur locked eyes with me. There was no apology, only toxic hatred. "You're dead to me, Chloe," he spat. "I have been for a long time, Arthur," I replied softly. It was the first time in my life I had called him by his first name. The immediate aftermath was a media spectacle that rocked the Chicago legal community. The Chicago Tribune ran a front-page exposé on the ghostwriter scandal. The state bar descended like locusts, clients fled, and Montgomery and Associates was placed into receivership. My family's legacy was ashes, but Martha Sterling still needed a lawyer. Dominic officially took over the case, hiring me as his lead litigation consultant. Earning 3 times my old salary, I sat beside Dominic opposite the high-priced defense lawyers from Bradshaw and Lockhart. When they tried to dismiss the fraud claim, I handed Dominic the exact medical timelines and offshore routing numbers I had compiled months ago. We didn't just settle, we decimated them, securing a $45 million settlement. Martha hugged me fiercely, handing me a personal check for $50,000, a gift for being the only person who actually fought for her. A few weeks later, Judge Caldwell requested my presence in his chambers. When Dominic and I arrived, Caldwell pushed a bound application booklet across his desk. It was the State Bar Examination registration packet. 3 years ago, when you explained that maritime tax loophole to me, I pulled your law school transcripts, Caldwell said softly. Top 10% of your class. Law review. I knew what Arthur was doing to you, but I couldn't prove it. The law is a shield, Chloe, and you know how to wield it. Take the exam again. The prep alone. I started, tears pricking my eyes. "Which is why my firm will sponsor your study time," Dominic interrupted. "I need a real partner, Chloe." The next 6 months were a blur of grueling, beautiful work. Every hour spent buried in constitutional law outlines was an act of reclamation. While I rebuilt my life, my family faced the consequences of theirs. Facing a decade in prison, Arthur took a plea deal, permanent disbarment, and 4 years in a federal correctional facility. Rebecca turned state's evidence against him to avoid jail, receiving 3 years of probation and a lifetime ban from practicing law. Her wealthy fiancé left her, and she ended up managing a suburban retail boutique, complaining to anyone who would listen that I had ruined her life. Exactly 1 year after I was fired, I stood in the state Supreme Court auditorium and took the solemn oath of attorney admission. Dominic was waiting at the bottom of the marble steps, holding a leather briefcase with my initials embossed in gold. "Ready to go to the office?" he asked, grinning. "I called a contractor this morning. We need to get the sign on the door changed before Monday." Today, the brass plaque outside our building officially reads Hayes and Montgomery. I didn't just survive my family's ruthless betrayal. I used it as the foundation to build an empire of my own. Arthur and Rebecca tried to bury me in the dark, forgetting that seeds need the dark to grow. I finally stepped out of the shadows, and the view from the light is absolutely magnificent.